There are people whose presence in the world feels so permanent, so woven into the fabric of everyday life, that even years after they are gone, the news of their absence still arrives like a fresh shock. Robin Williams was one of those people. 15 years have now passed since his death in August of 2014, and the grief the world felt that day has never entirely dissolved. It simply changed shape, because what emerged in the years that followed was not just mourning. It was a reckoning, a slow, painful reassessment of what had really been happening to one of the most beloved performers who ever lived, and what his children have since confirmed about the man behind the laughter. The public version of Robin Williams was almost impossible to separate from the performance. He was the human embodiment of creative electricity, a man who could shift between 12 characters in 30 seconds, who improvised entire scenes that directors kept because nothing in the script came close, who made audiences laugh so hard they forgot, temporarily, whatever was weighing on them. That was the version the world knew. But his children, Zach, Zelda, and Cody, have spent the years since his death carefully, deliberately dismantling the distance between the public image and the private reality. What they have confirmed is not a scandal. It is something more complicated and more human than that. To understand what they have revealed, you have to start not at the end, but somewhere in the middle, at a period when the warning signs were already present, but no one, not his family, not his doctors, not even Robin himself, had the framework to understand what they were seeing. By 2009, Robin Williams had already lived through more professional reinventions than most performers manage in a lifetime. He had gone from a breakout television alien to a stand-up phenomenon to an Oscar-winning dramatic actor. That year, he underwent significant heart surgery at the Cleveland Clinic, an aortic valve replacement combined with a mitral valve repair, a serious procedure that required real recovery time and temporarily interrupted the relentless pace he had maintained for decades. At the time, it appeared to be a contained medical event. He recovered. He returned to work. And then, gradually, something began to shift. Colleagues on his later sets started noticing things that were hard to name precisely. Tremors, sleep disruption, moments of anxiety that seemed outsized for the situation, occasional lapses in the verbal precision and rapid recall that had always been the engine of his creative identity. These symptoms did not arrive all at once in a way that pointed clearly toward a single explanation. They accumulated slowly, fragmenting across different areas of his functioning, making them easy to misattribute to aging, exhaustion, or the natural wear of a career lived at full intensity. At a certain point, Robin Williams was told he had Parkinson's disease. The diagnosis seemed to account for the tremors and the motor changes, but as time passed, the progression did not behave the way Parkinson's typically does. The cognitive symptoms were too pronounced, the emotional volatility was too severe. The anxiety and insomnia and confusion did not fit cleanly into the picture that the Parkinson's diagnosis painted. His medical team struggled to connect all the pieces. His family struggled to understand what they were witnessing, and Robin himself, according to those who were closest to him, was aware that something was wrong in a way that went beyond what any single diagnosis was capturing. The explanation arrived only after his death, and it arrived with the weight of a revelation that reframed everything. When pathologists conducted the autopsy, they found extensive deposits of Lewy bodies throughout his brain. These are abnormal protein accumulations that progressively interfere with the communication between neurons and damage multiple brain systems simultaneously. The findings were not subtle. Medical experts who reviewed the case described it as one of the most extensive presentations of diffuse Lewy body dementia they had ever encountered. The condition had been present, advancing, reshaping his brain, while the world watched him perform and assumed what they were seeing was simply the man they had always known. What makes diffuse Lewy body dementia so particularly cruel and so particularly relevant to understanding Robin Williams' final years is the breadth of its attack. Unlike Alzheimer's disease, which targets memory above all else, or Parkinson's disease, which primarily disrupts movement, Lewy body dementia strikes across multiple systems at once. Cognition, emotion, perception, sleep regulation, motor function, It can present differently from one day to the next, making it extraordinarily difficult to diagnose, especially in its earlier stages, because it mimics so many other conditions simultaneously. His widow, Susan Schneider Williams, described the experience of watching it from the inside in terms that stayed with everyone who read them. She wrote that the disease functioned like a terrorist operating inside her husband's brain. She described symptoms that seemed to shift their nature from one day to the next. What appeared to be a psychological problem one morning would manifest as a neurological one by evening. Doctors treated individual symptoms without being able to see the underlying cause that was driving all of them. Looking back, she wrote that Robin was losing his mind and that he knew it was happening. That detail is perhaps the most difficult one to sit with. He was aware. He was experiencing the erosion of the very faculties that had defined his entire life, the rapid recall, the creative fluidity, the ability to hold a dozen voices and characters in his head simultaneously, and he could feel them slipping. The anxiety and fear he exhibited in those final months, which at the time seemed puzzling to those around him, were not irrational responses to imagined threats. They were the responses of a man watching himself disappear from the inside. His son, Zach Williams, has spoken publicly about the process of understanding that the family went through after the autopsy findings became known. He described it as a form of reconstruction, of looking back at events that had seemed disconnected or mysterious and suddenly seeing them as part of a coherent medical story. Moments that had been interpreted as stress or mood or the emotional weight of a difficult period were re-examined and recognized as symptoms of a brain disease. His daughter Zelda Williams has been equally clear, and perhaps even more direct, in pushing back against what she sees as an oversimplification of her father's story. She has challenged, repeatedly and publicly, the tendency to reduce his final years to a single narrative of depression or to explain his death through one explanatory lens and call the matter closed. Her argument is not that depression played no role. It is that centering depression as the sole or primary explanation ignores the devastating and progressive neurological disease that was simultaneously dismantling his cognition, his emotional regulation, and his perception of reality. She has described him as a person, not a caricature, and resisted the flattening of a complex human life into a tidy public myth. That insistence on complexity is worth pausing on, because it extends beyond the medical facts into something deeper about who Robin Williams actually was as a human being, separate from the persona the public consumed for decades. He was born in Chicago on July 21, 1951, and raised in the affluent suburbs of Marin County, California. His father was a senior executive at Ford Motor Company who traveled frequently for work, and his childhood was largely spent in large, quiet homes with more space than company. By his own later accounts, and those collected by biographers who researched his life carefully, the young Robin Williams filled that silence with invented worlds. He created characters and voices to occupy the emptiness. Teachers remembered him not as conventionally disruptive, but as someone whose imagination moved faster than any structure around him could contain. He studied briefly at Claremont Men's College before being admitted to the Juilliard School in New York, where he joined an advanced acting program that accepted only a handful of students. His instructors, including the formidable John Houseman, recognized immediately that his talent was not in question. His restraint was, he was the student who could shift accents, physicality, and emotional register within seconds, who could not be confined to scripted material even in controlled classroom settings. Houseman reportedly concluded that Williams had no real choice but to succeed. The gift was too large to go anywhere else. When he appeared as Mork on a single episode of Happy Days in 1978, the audience response was so immediate and so strong that the network reversed course and built an entirely new series around the character. Mork and Mindy premiered that same year, and what followed was not simply a career launch, but a cultural phenomenon. Production teams quickly learned that standard scripting boundaries did not apply to Robin Williams. Writers rewrote scenes after shooting had already begun. Crew members described filming sessions that repeatedly halted because his improvisation had taken the scene somewhere the script never anticipated. Rather than disciplining him, producers began structuring episodes to accommodate what he generated in real time. The industry bent to fit him, because the alternative constraining him produced something smaller and less alive than what he created when left to his own instincts. The 1980s brought both his greatest creative achievements and his first serious confrontation with the costs of the life he was living. His friend and fellow comedian John Belushi died in 1982 from a drug overdose, and Williams later described that loss as a rupture that forced him to look directly at his own relationship with substances. He achieved sobriety, spoke openly about it in interviews over the years, and framed it not as a single victory, but as an ongoing negotiation. Relapses occurred, particularly during periods of prolonged stress or exhaustion, and he was honest about that too. What biographers who examined his life most carefully concluded was that addiction, in his case, was one thread within a larger pattern of extreme intensity rather than its defining feature. Through the 1980s and into the 90s, he delivered a body of work that defies easy categorization. Good Morning, Vietnam showed he could merge improvisational comedy with narrative filmmaking. Dead Poets Society demonstrated that he could anchor a film on emotional restraint alone. The Fisher King, Aladdin, Mrs. Doubtfire, and ultimately Good Will Hunting, the performance that earned him the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor in 1998, together mapped a range that almost no other performer of his generation could claim. He was not settling into a single identity. He was deliberately preventing one from forming. Zach Williams has described his father's work ethic as defined by total immersion. When Robin was engaged in a project, he was completely inside it. Between projects, there were withdrawals, periods of quiet, and sometimes emotional unavailability that those around him had to navigate. Zach has described his father's presence as something that arrived in concentrated bursts rather than sustained daily continuity, shaped by filming schedules, touring demands, and the internal rhythms of someone whose professional life rarely paused long enough for stillness to settle. The Private Robin Williams, as his children have carefully described him, was not the hurricane of comic energy the public expected. He was a man of genuine warmth and deep affection, but also of complexity and contradiction. Someone who could be fully present in one moment and unreachable the next. Someone whose humor in private settings was real and unperformed, but who also carried internal pressures that did not always surface in ways the people around him could identify or address. By the time the final years arrived, those internal pressures had been joined by something that no one yet had a name for. The tremors that colleagues noticed on the set of Night at the Museum. Secret of the Tomb in 2014. The moments when lines that would once have come instantly required visible effort to retrieve. The anxiety that had grown into something constant and overwhelming. The insomnia and confusion that his wife watched consume him from one direction while doctors chased it from another. All of it, in retrospect, was the disease. But at the time, no one knew that, and Robin faced it without the one thing that might have made it bearable, a diagnosis that told him what was happening to him and why.